He stood outside his own house, facing a news camera, asking for his pregnant wife and 2 little daughters to come home. His voice was low, his arms folded across his chest. His face carried the look of a man who wanted the world to believe he was scared. But inside that house, the truth had already started speaking. Shanann's phone was still there. Her purse was still there. Her medication was still there. Her vehicle was still sitting in the garage. The children's car seats had not moved. And the man asking America to help find his family already knew the one thing nobody else knew yet. They were never coming home. Within days, the image of a quiet Colorado husband cracked wide open. A welfare check, a friend who refused to ignore silence, a neighbor's camera, a failed lie detector, and one carefully pressured interview would expose one of the most disturbing family murder cases in modern American history. But the most chilling part is not only what Chris Watts did, it is how ordinary everything looked before the truth broke through. This was not a story that began with sirens. It began with missed calls. It began with unanswered texts. It began with a friend standing outside a closed door, realizing that something was wrong before the police, before the media, before the world. And if she had waited, even a little longer, the first version of the story might have lasted longer than it did. Before we go deeper, like this video and subscribe to True Crime Investigator Alex, because this case shows why the smallest detail, the call that goes unanswered, the appointment someone misses, the friend who refuses to leave, can become the first crack in a killer's story. To understand this case, do not start with Chris Watts's childhood. Do not start with old family photos. Do not start with the smiling posts and the image of a suburban life. Start with the morning the house went quiet. On August 13th, 2018, Shanann Watts was back in Colorado after a business trip to Arizona. She was pregnant, a mother of 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, and she was expected to return to her normal routine. That routine mattered. It mattered because Nicole Atkinson knew it. Nicole had dropped Shanann off at home in the early morning hours. She knew Shanann was tired. She knew Shanann had obligations later. She knew Shanann was not the kind of person who would vanish from everyone who cared about her without a word. Later that morning, Shanann did not answer calls. She did not answer texts. She missed a scheduled medical appointment. That single missed appointment was not proof of a crime. It was not enough by itself to solve anything. But it was enough to make Nicole uncomfortable. And in true crime cases, discomfort often matters before evidence does. Nicole did what many people might have talked themselves out of doing. She went to the house. She knocked. She rang. She waited. She tried to make sense of the silence. From the outside, the home on Saratoga Trail looked like a home where life had only paused for a moment. A family dog was inside. A vehicle was in the garage. The neighborhood was calm. Nothing about the street announced that a major crime investigation was about to begin. That is what makes the first hours of this case so important. The danger did not look loud. It looked normal. Chris Watts was contacted. Police were called for a welfare check. Officer James Coonrod arrived at the residence and began the first official look into a situation that still seemed, on paper, like a missing person concern. At that moment, Chris was not yet the convicted killer the world would come to know. He was the husband being called home. He was the father being asked where his wife and children were. He was the man everyone needed answers from. And when he arrived, his behavior became part of the story. The home did not give police the kind of answers Chris would later try to suggest. Shanann's personal belongings were there. Her phone was found. Her purse, wallet, and medication were located in the house. Her vehicle remained in the garage. The children's car seats were there. This mattered, because Chris suggested Shanann might have left with the girls. But the house was pushing back against that idea. A pregnant mother leaving suddenly with 2 small children would normally need her phone. She would need her medication. She would need a way to transport the children. She would not likely leave behind the very things that connected her to safety, family, and daily life. The house did not look like a clean departure. It looked like a story interrupted. And yet, Chris kept presenting himself as confused. He told police Shanann had come home from her trip. He said they had talked about separation. He said the conversation was emotional but not explosive. He said she had later planned to go somewhere with the girls, though he claimed he did not know where. Every sentence created more questions. Why would she leave without her phone? Why would she leave without her vehicle? Why would she miss a medical appointment? Why would she stop responding to the people closest to her? Why would the house look like she had not prepared to go anywhere at all? At this stage, investigators had to hold two realities at once. Reality 1, Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were missing. Reality 2, the person closest to them was offering a version of events that did not match the physical details inside the home. That is where this case begins to tighten, because the first lie in a murder case is rarely the last lie. And Chris Watts did not only lie to police, he lied to cameras. He lied to neighbors. He lied to friends. He lied to the public. He lied in the language of a worried husband, while the investigation was already building around him. The porch interview became one of the most unforgettable moments in the case. Chris stood outside the home and spoke to reporters as if he were a father trapped in uncertainty. He said he wanted his family back. He said he wanted them safe. He said the house was empty without them. On the surface, those words sounded like grief. But grief has weight. Fear has urgency. Panic has motion. And what many people saw in that interview was something different. They saw a man who looked controlled, a man who seemed to choose his words carefully, a man talking about his missing pregnant wife and daughters with a calm that did not match the nightmare he claimed to be living. Body language alone does not convict anyone. A strange interview is not proof of murder. But when that interview is placed beside the phone, the purse, the medication, the car seats, the neighbor's camera, and the timeline, it becomes something else. It becomes part of a pattern. That is the key with Chris Watts. No single moment tells the whole story. The truth came from pressure. Pressure from Nicole Atkinson. Pressure from the house. Pressure from the neighbor's footage. Pressure from investigators. Pressure from the timeline. Pressure from his own inability to keep the story straight. One of the most important people in the early timeline was not a detective. It was Nicole. Her concern forced movement. She did not accept silence as normal. She did not assume Shanann needed space. She did not let Chris control the timeline from a distance. She pushed. She waited. She contacted police. She stayed close enough to watch the first cracks form. And that decision mattered because Chris's story needed time. It needed space. It needed people to believe that Shanann had left on her own. But Nicole's actions gave him neither. When Chris entered the house after arriving, investigators later noted details that mattered. He went inside before opening the front door. He appeared to search, but later reporting from the investigation would show that even these movements raised questions. The truth was already inside that house. Not in one dramatic object, not in one single clue, but in the absence of normal life, the absence of Shanann's phone in her hand, the absence of movement from the girls, the absence of any reasonable explanation for why a pregnant mother would walk away from her home without the items she relied on. And then came the neighbor's camera. In many cases, surveillance footage gives investigators a clear answer. In this case, it gave them a tightening question. A neighbor's security system captured Chris's truck during the early morning hours. The footage did not reveal everything. It did not show the full crime. It did not give the public every answer. But it showed enough movement around the truck to matter. When Chris watched that footage with law enforcement and the neighbor nearby, the atmosphere changed. That moment remains one of the most unsettling pieces of the public record, because the viewer can feel the pressure without anyone shouting. Chris is not being accused in that room yet. He is watching. The officer is watching. The neighbor is watching. And every second of that recording makes his version of a normal morning harder to believe. That is where the story begins to shift from missing persons to suspicion. The question is no longer only, where are Shanann, Bella, and Celeste? The question becomes, what did Chris do before he left for work? And why does the camera matter so much? Chris told officers he left for work that morning. He described backing his truck into the driveway, loading tools, and leaving. On its own, that might sound routine. He worked in the oil field. A work truck leaving early did not look strange without context. But context changed everything. His wife and daughters were missing. Their necessary belongings were still in the home. No one could reach Shanann. The vehicle had not moved. And now, the neighbor's footage placed Chris's truck at the center of the early morning window. That is how ordinary details become powerful. A driveway, a garage, a truck, a phone left behind, a car seat seen inside a vehicle, a friend who refuses to leave. By themselves, each detail may look small. Together, they form a net. Chris kept trying to move through that net like a man who still had control, but control was leaving him fast. The public version of Chris Watts was simple. Quiet husband, father, worker, neighbor, someone people described as calm, polite, and unthreatening. That image helped him, for a while, because people often struggle to connect ordinary appearances with extreme crimes. They look at a man who smiles in family photos and ask, how could someone like that do something like this? But the problem with that question is that it gives the image too much power. A photograph does not prove character. A soft voice does not prove innocence. A suburban home does not prove safety. And a man who knows how to look harmless can still be dangerous behind closed doors. The case against Chris Watts did not come from a single emotional guess. It came from documented inconsistencies, physical evidence, investigative interviews, and the collapse of his own statements. As the first day passed, the investigation grew. Detectives became involved. A neighborhood canvass was conducted. A broader search began. By the next day, authorities knew Shanann and the girls had not returned. The case was no longer a simple welfare concern. The clock mattered. With each passing hour, Chris had to keep explaining the impossible. Where was Shanann? Where were Bella and Celeste? Why had no one heard from them? Why did the home contain the items Shanann would need? Why did the timeline keep turning back toward him? Then came another layer. Investigators learned Chris was involved in an affair with a co-worker, Nicole Atkinson. This fact must be handled carefully. Nicole Atkinson was not charged in the murders. The public record does not support blaming her for what Chris did. Even Chris later told investigators that she never asked him to get rid of his family. He said the relationship contributed to the situation, but he did not say she directed the crime. That distinction matters, because true crime must not become rumor. A documented affair is part of motive analysis. It is not a license to accuse someone without evidence. What the affair shows is this: Chris Watts was living a double life. In one life, he was a husband and father with a pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. In another life, he was presenting himself as a man moving towards separation, a man imagining a different future, a man making space for a relationship outside his marriage. And that double life created pressure. Pressure at home, pressure in messages, pressure in planning, pressure in identity. Chris wanted to be seen one way by Shanann, another way by Atkinson, and another way by the world. But when a person builds too many versions of himself, the lies begin to compete. By early August, Chris had reportedly told Atkinson that he had talked to Shanann about separating. Atkinson started looking for apartments for him, according to the later investigative report. That detail matters because it shows Chris was not only emotionally drifting, he was moving his future on paper. A new place, a new story, a new identity. But Shanann was still his wife. Bella and Celeste were still his daughters. Nico, their unborn son, was still part of the family's future. And Chris did not choose divorce. He did not choose honesty. He did not choose the hard, legal, painful path of ending a marriage. He chose violence. Then he tried to cover it with confusion. That is why the porch interview remains so haunting. He was not standing there because he had no idea what happened. He was standing there because he wanted the world to believe he had no idea. There is a huge difference. As investigators pressed forward, Chris agreed to more questioning. That decision may look strange now, but at the time, he still seemed to believe he could manage the room. He had already managed people before. He had managed his image. He had managed conversations. He had managed the early police contact. He had managed the porch interview. But an interview room is different from a porch. A porch interview lets a person perform for the public. An interview room strips the performance down. There is no friendly neighborhood backdrop, no family home behind him, no news microphone, no audience to manipulate directly, only questions, only timelines, only silence after an answer, only trained investigators listening for the one place where the story breaks. The polygraph became one of the case's turning points. A polygraph is not magic. It does not solve a case by itself. It is an investigative tool, not a perfect truth machine. But in this case, it became a psychological wall. Chris went into that room, still clinging to a version of events where he was not responsible. But after hours of questioning and the pressure of the exam, he could feel the space closing around him. Later, during the prison follow-up interview, he said walking into that room felt like he was not walking out. That sentence matters because it means he knew the investigation had moved past the story he gave on the porch. He knew the missing family narrative was collapsing. He knew the people asking questions were no longer reacting to him like a worried husband. They were reacting to him like the center of the case. The first confession he gave was not the full truth. This is one of the most important parts of the case, because even when Chris began admitting guilt, he still tried to control the story. He first gave investigators a false version that shifted blame towards Shanann. That version suggested he reacted after something happened to the girls. It was devastating, cruel, and later rejected by the full weight of the case and by his later admissions. This is where the documentary must be careful. Do not give that false claim power. Do not frame it as an open mystery. Do not let the killer's lie compete with the victim's truth. Shanann was the victim. Bella was the victim. Celeste was the victim. Nico was the victim. Chris Watts pleaded guilty to their murders. That is the legal and factual anchor. Everything else must orbit that anchor. Even in confession, Chris was still trying to manage consequences. He was still trying to shape how his family, his parents, investigators, and the public would see him. He did not begin with full accountability. He began with a version that softened his own image by damaging Shanann's. That is one of the ugliest parts of this case. The harm did not end when the murders happened. It continued through the lie. It continued through the attempt to make a victim carry blame she could no longer answer. And that is why responsible storytelling matters here. This case is not only about catching a killer, it is about refusing to let his first lie become the final story. By August 15th, 2018, Chris Watts was arrested. The missing person case had changed into a murder investigation. Authorities had located the recovery site connected to his work. The public would soon learn that the search for a missing pregnant mother and 2 little girls had ended in the worst possible way. From that point forward, the national attention became massive. People asked how a father could do this. They asked how a husband could stand on television and ask for the return of a family he had already killed. They asked how the warning signs had been missed. They asked whether the affair explained it. They asked whether money explained it. They asked whether image explained it. They asked whether Chris had been planning a new life and saw his family as an obstacle. But careful reporting must separate what is documented from what is assumed. Here is what is documented. Chris Watts was Shanann's husband. He was Bella and Celeste's father. Shanann was pregnant with Nico. Shanann returned home in the early morning hours of August 13th. Nicole Atkinson became worried when Shanann did not respond and missed a medical appointment. Police conducted a welfare check. Shanann's personal items were found inside the home. Neighbor footage became part of the investigation. Investigators learned Chris had been involved in an affair. Chris failed to maintain his story under pressure. He was arrested. He was formally charged. He pleaded guilty to all 9 counts. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Those are the hard rails of the story. Everything else must be handled with discipline. Now, let us return to the part that makes this case so chilling from a storytelling perspective. Chris Watts did not run immediately. He did not vanish. He did not refuse to appear in public. He went home. He spoke to police. He stood before cameras. He gave the public a performance of confusion. That choice tells us something about how he viewed himself in the early hours. He seemed to believe that he could still influence the room. He seemed to think calmness would read as innocence. He seemed to believe that if he said the right things, people would accept the idea that Shanann had left, but the facts were not cooperating. The house was not cooperating. Nicole was not cooperating. The neighbor's camera was not cooperating. The timeline was not cooperating. And investigators were not cooperating. This is why the case moves with such brutal speed. Some cases remain open for years because the evidence is scattered, the timeline is weak, or the suspect stays hidden. This case moved fast because the story Chris gave did not survive contact with reality. Every layer made the center clearer. A missed appointment, a concerned friend, a home filled with left-behind belongings, a truck captured on video, an affair he had denied, a lie detector he could not get past, a confession that started with deception, then charges, then a plea, then life in prison. But speed does not make the case less tragic. In fact, it makes it more disturbing. Because for a short time, America watched a man pretend, and because the performance happened before the full truth, the public became part of the manipulation. Viewers saw him speak, neighbors saw him cooperate, reporters heard him ask for his family's return. And then everyone had to look back at that footage with the knowledge that he was not pleading for rescue. He was covering his crime. That kind of reversal creates the dark pull of the Chris Watts case. The audience does not only want to know what happened, they want to understand how they were almost made to believe the wrong thing. That is why the first act of this story must stay on the lie. The porch is the hook. The house is the evidence. The friend is the alarm. The camera is the pressure. The interview room is the collapse. The courtroom is the accountability. And the victims are the reason the story must never become entertainment detached from truth. Let us talk about Shanann without turning her into a footnote. Shanann Watts was not only Chris Watts' wife. She was a daughter, a friend, a mother, and a woman with a life of her own. She had routines. She had appointments. She had people who expected to hear from her. She had a friend who knew her well enough to recognize danger in silence. That matters because many crime stories accidentally center the killer so much that the victims fade into labels. In this story, Shanann's routine helped reveal the truth. Her missed appointment mattered. Her unanswered messages mattered. Her belongings left behind mattered. Her friend's knowledge of her habits mattered. The case did not break open because Chris confessed out of pure conscience. It broke open because Shanann's life had patterns, and those patterns did not match his lie. Bella and Celeste must also remain more than names in a charge sheet. They were little girls. They had car seats. They had routines. They were part of the home Chris tried to explain away. Their absence from that house turned the welfare check into something far more serious. And Nico, Shanann's unborn son, was recognized in the charges through unlawful termination of pregnancy. That legal count mattered because it acknowledged that the violence took more than 3 lives. It took the future Shanann was carrying. When prosecutors brought charges, they charged Chris with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. 5 murder counts can sound confusing at first, because there were 3 named victims who had been born. But the structure of the charges reflected Colorado law and included separate first-degree murder theories, including counts related to children under a position of trust. For the documentary, you do not need to over-explain the legal mechanics. You need to make the audience understand the weight. The state did not treat this as a tragic household incident. The state treated it as a full criminal case against a man accused of murdering his pregnant wife and daughters, then trying to hide what he had done. By November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all 9 counts. This removed the need for a trial. And for many people watching, that plea created a complicated feeling. On one hand, it meant there would be no long courtroom battle over guilt. On the other hand, it meant the public would not hear every piece of evidence presented in trial form. But the family supported removing the death penalty from consideration in exchange for the guilty plea. This decision matters because outsiders often demand the harshest possible public spectacle, while families must live with the pain that spectacle creates. The Razuchek family had already lost Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. A trial would have forced them through months, possibly longer, of public testimony, crime details, legal argument, and media attention. The plea gave legal finality. It did not give healing. But it stopped one kind of suffering from expanding. That is why the sentencing carried so much emotional weight. The courtroom became the place where the public lie finally met legal truth. Chris Watts was no longer the man on the porch asking for his family back. He was the defendant who had admitted guilt. He was the husband and father convicted of destroying the people he had once claimed to love. He was sentenced to life without parole. The CBI report later described the sentence as 3 consecutive life terms, plus additional years, without the possibility of parole. That is the legal ending. But it is not the emotional ending. Because the hardest part of the Chris Watts case is that justice could punish him, but it could not restore what he took. This is where many true crime scripts lose balance. They chase the killer's psychology so deeply that the victims become background. But in this case, the right balance is clear. Chris Watts is the subject of the investigation. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico are the heart of the story. The audience must feel the horror of the deception, but they must also understand the human loss beyond the headline. That loss began long before the world knew their names. It began in the private space of a home where trust should have meant safety. It began when a husband decided that lies were easier than honesty. It began when image became more important than responsibility. It began when a man wanted a different life, but chose the most destructive path to reach it. By the time the public saw him on the porch, the central crime had already happened. What remained was the cover story. That cover story was weak from the beginning. Chris needed people to believe Shanann left, but Shanann left too much behind. He needed people to believe he was confused, but his timeline made him central. He needed people to believe he wanted answers, but he already had them. He needed investigators to accept an emotional separation conversation as the reason Shanann might disappear. But the evidence inside the home made that theory hard to accept, and he needed the camera to miss what mattered. But it did not. The neighbor's footage became the silent witness. It did not speak in a courtroom voice. It did not explain motive. It did not cry. It did not accuse. It simply recorded. That is why surveillance footage has such power in modern true crime. It removes performance. A person can lie to an officer. A person can lie to a reporter. A person can lie to a friend. But footage captures movement without caring about the story someone tells later. When Chris watched that footage, he was not only seeing video, he was seeing the first outside record of his private lie. And he had to watch it with other people in the room. That is pressure, not loud pressure. Quiet pressure, the kind that makes a person aware that the story is no longer fully in his hands. From there, the investigation moved toward the interview room. Tammy Lee and the other investigators did not need to scream at him. They did not need to perform outrage. They needed to keep him talking long enough for his own answers to trap him. That is the rhythm your script should hold. Question, answer, contradiction, silence. Another question, a longer answer, a smaller space to hide. Chris had built his first story for the public. But public statements are broad. They survive on emotion. They rely on people not knowing the details yet. Interrogations are different. Investigators ask about times. They ask about movements. They ask about conversations. They ask about what was seen, what was touched, what was left behind, what was moved, what was said, who called, who texted, who knew. A lie that sounds believable in a short television clip can collapse under detailed questioning. That is exactly what happened. The polygraph added another layer. Once Chris was told he had not passed, the room changed again. At that point, he had a choice. Tell the truth. Ask for a lawyer. Keep denying. Or offer a controlled confession that still protected his image. He chose the last path first. He admitted part of the truth, but wrapped it in a lie about Shanann. That move shows why partial confessions are dangerous. They sound like breakthroughs. They feel like progress. They create the illusion that the suspect has finally opened up. But sometimes, a partial confession is just another strategy. It gives investigators enough to explain some facts, while still pushing blame away from the person speaking. Chris's first version tried to make him less monstrous by making Shanann look responsible for something she did not do. That is why the later guilty plea and later admissions matter. They cut through the first confession's manipulation. They show that the first confession was not full truth. It was damage control. And that phrase, damage control, defines much of Chris Watts' behavior after the murders. The porch interview was damage control. The missing family story was damage control. The suggestion that Shanann left was damage control. The first confession was damage control. Even his calmness can be understood as damage control. He was not moving through the early hours like a man searching for truth. He was moving like a man trying to manage exposure. And exposure came anyway. In the middle of this case, we need to stop and separate hard facts from online mythology. There are many theories about Chris Watts. There are many debates about motive. There are endless arguments about his relationship, finances, family dynamics, and personality. Some of those topics come from documented records. Some come from speculation. Some come from people trying to fill emotional gaps that the legal record does not fully answer. But we do not need wild theories to make this case disturbing. The documented facts are enough. A pregnant woman and 2 children were reported missing. The husband and father asked for their return on camera. Their belongings and key signs of normal movement did not support his story. Investigators uncovered evidence that tightened around him. He confessed, then pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. No rumor improves that. No exaggeration makes it more serious. The truth is already heavy. And that is why this story must be told cleanly. If you are still watching, like this video, and subscribe to True Crime Investigator Alex. We follow the verified record, not internet noise, because the victims deserve facts, and the audience deserves a story that does not trade accuracy for shock. Now we go back to the timeline. The weekend before Shanann returned, Chris was home with Bella and Celeste, while Shanann was away on a business trip. This detail matters because it places him in full control of the home before the final morning. Shanann returned in the early morning hours. Nicole dropped her off. That was one of the last normal acts in the timeline. A friend bringing another friend home. There is something painfully ordinary about that. A ride from the airport, a tired return, a front door, a quiet neighborhood. The kind of moment no one expects to become part of a murder timeline. Later that morning, silence began replacing normal communication. Nicole noticed. Nicole called. Nicole texted. Nicole went to the house. That is how the case entered public life, through concern, not through Chris, through Nicole. And that difference matters. Chris did not raise the first alarm in the way an innocent spouse might be expected to. Nicole pushed the issue. Nicole brought pressure to the door. Nicole's concern forced Chris to come home and face police earlier than he may have wanted. This is one reason the case moved fast. The first person who refused to accept the disappearance was not the person who caused it. It was the friend who knew Shanann's silence was not normal. When police entered the home, they found no sign that Shanann and the girls were simply waiting somewhere obvious. The house became an investigative space. The purse, the phone, the medication, the vehicle, the car seats. Each detail pulled the case away from voluntary disappearance, and each detail made Chris's calm explanations feel less stable. He said there had been a conversation about separation. That may have sounded like a reason for emotional distance, but it did not explain the physical reality inside the home. A separation conversation does not explain a missed medical appointment. It does not explain a pregnant woman leaving without key belongings. It does not explain children gone without the obvious transportation signs. It does not explain why no one could reach her. And it does not explain why Chris's truck became so important. The neighbor, Nate Trinastich, had surveillance footage from the area. That footage showed Chris's truck and helped investigators examine the early morning movement. The power of that moment is not only in what the footage showed, it is in how Chris reacted while watching it. Again, reaction alone is not evidence of guilt, but reaction plus timeline, plus physical evidence, plus later confession, becomes part of the story. And the story was closing in. Chris's public persona could not survive detailed review. The more people looked, the worse it became. That is often how deception works. It looks strongest from a distance. It weakens when someone moves closer. From a distance, Chris could look like a worried father. Closer in, he was the last person known to be with Shanann. Closer in, his wife's belongings were still inside. Closer in, his truck was on camera. Closer in, his affair became known. Closer in, his statements did not hold. Closer in, his story broke. That movement from distance to close-up is the spine of this documentary. The public saw the porch. Investigators saw the details, and the details told a different story. Chris's affair with Nicole Atkinson became one of the most discussed parts of the case, but it must be presented with care. The CBI report shows that investigators later asked Chris about the affair and related claims. Chris told them Atkinson never asked him to get rid of his family. He said the relationship contributed, but he did not place responsibility for his actions on her as a legal actor. This is important because the public often wants a wider conspiracy when the central truth feels too disturbing. It is emotionally hard to accept that one person inside a family could do this. So people search for other forces, a hidden mastermind, a larger plot, a secret reason. But the verified record does not need that. Chris Watts made the choices that led to the murders. The affair gives context to the life he was trying to build. It does not transfer guilt. The better question is not, who else can we blame? The better question is, why did Chris choose destruction instead of honesty? He could have separated. He could have filed for divorce. He could have told the truth. He could have accepted financial pain, family pain, public embarrassment, and emotional consequences. Those paths were hard, but they were legal. They were survivable. They were human. Instead, he tried to erase the life that stood between him and the image he wanted. That is why prosecutors and the public struggled so deeply with motive. Because even when motive is discussed, it never feels large enough. An affair is not enough. Debt is not enough. Marital conflict is not enough. A desire for freedom is not enough. None of those things explain murder in a way that makes it understandable. They only show the pressures Chris chose to answer with violence. That distinction matters. Explaining context is not excusing conduct, and the script must make that clear. By the time Chris was in the interview room, investigators were not only asking what happened, they were testing the person he had pretended to be: the good husband, the quiet father, the cooperative witness, the grieving man. Every version was under pressure. Tammy Lee's role in the interrogation became widely discussed because she kept the tone controlled while making it clear that his story failed. That approach matters for pacing. The interrogation is not gripping because it is chaotic. It is gripping because it is calm. The calm is what makes it tense. A calm question, a calm denial, a calm statement that the result does not support him, a calm suspect realizing the room has changed. That is far more powerful than shouting. Chris's first collapse did not bring full truth. It brought a false story wrapped around partial responsibility. Investigators had to keep moving past it. The legal case did. The guilty plea did. The later prison interview did. In February 2019, investigators visited Chris in prison for a follow-up interview. The report from that interview became one of the most revealing documents in the case because Chris spoke about the murders, the affair, the investigation, his statements, and his thinking after conviction. By then, he had already been sentenced. He had no trial to prepare for. He had no public innocence story left. And yet, even then, his words had to be handled carefully. A convicted killer can still lie. A confession can still contain self-protection. A later interview can clarify some facts and muddy others. That is why the script should treat Chris's statements as documented statements, not automatic truth in every emotional detail. When he says something that aligns with evidence and the legal record, it helps explain the case. When he talks about his feelings, motives, or inner state, present it as what he told investigators, not as an unquestionable fact. This protects the story from overclaiming. It also keeps the script credible. For example, the report says Chris acknowledged that his relationship with Kessinger contributed to the murders, while also stating she never asked him to do anything. That is a key factual balance. The report also records that he knew the interview room was serious, that the polygraph process broke him down, and that he later admitted some of the actions he took after returning to the home during the welfare check. These details help build the narrative of collapse. They show how the public performance and the private evidence moved in opposite directions. The report showed a man pretending to search. The interview showed investigators searching through him. And the court showed the final legal answer. On August 20th, 2018, Watts was formally charged. The charges were severe, layered, and unmistakable. 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of pregnancy, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. Those charges placed the full weight of the case into the public record. By November, he had pleaded guilty. That plea removed any public claim of innocence, and at sentencing, the court imposed life without parole. The legal system had answered the question of guilt. But for many people, another question stayed open. Why? That question is dangerous in true crime because it can pull a script into speculation, but it is also unavoidable because motive is part of how humans process horror. So the safest way to handle it is this. The record shows marital strain. The record shows an affair. The record shows Chris had discussed separation. The record shows he was presenting different versions of his life to different people. The record shows he murdered his family and tried to hide the truth. Anything beyond that must be framed as analysis, not fact. What we can say is that Chris Watts appeared to want a life that did not include the family he already had. What we can say is that he chose murder over accountability. What we can say is that his first instinct after the crime was not honesty, but image control. What we can say is that his public plea for his family's return was false. Those points are documented enough to carry the story. The emotional force of the case comes from the gap between image and truth. The image was a family man. The truth was a family annihilator. The image was concern. The truth was concealment. The image was a quiet suburban home. The truth was a crime scene. The image was a husband asking for help. The truth was a killer asking for belief. That contrast is what keeps viewers watching, but it must never be handled like fiction. These were real people. Shanann's parents had to hear their daughter discussed in court. Her children's names became part of a national tragedy. Their family memories became evidence. Their private pain became public record. And the man responsible became infamous. That is why the ending must return to them. Not to Chris's prison life, not to his letters, not to people who still obsess over him. The story must end where the truth belongs. With Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Before the ending, though, there is one more important layer, the speed of the unraveling. Chris's lie lasted only a short time, but it has been studied for years. Why? Because it shows how quickly a false image can collapse when ordinary people and investigators act fast. Nicole Atkinson's concern mattered. Officer Coonrod's welfare check mattered. Detective Baumhover's observations mattered. The neighbors' surveillance mattered. The CBI and FBI involvement mattered. The polygraph mattered. The pressure of ordinary facts mattered. This case was not solved by one dramatic movie moment. It was solved by accumulation. That is the lesson. In real investigations, truth often arrives as a stack. One detail is placed on another. A timeline forms. A statement fails. A witness adds pressure. A video narrows the window. A search confirms the fear. A confession cracks the surface. Charges lock the record. A plea ends the argument. The Chris Watts case is a brutal example of that stack. And it began with a friend who would not ignore silence. Think about that. In the first hours, before the public outrage, before the documentaries, before the court, before the prison interview, There was a woman outside a door saying, "This is not right." That instinct deserves attention, because people often hesitate in moments like that. They worry about overreacting. They worry about being dramatic. They worry about invading privacy. They wait. Nicole did not wait, and because she did not wait, Chris lost time. He lost control. He lost the ability to stretch the disappearance story into something more believable. Her urgency forced the case into motion. That does not undo the tragedy, but it matters. It shows that paying attention can change a timeline. It shows that friendship can become evidence. It shows that knowing someone's normal behavior can expose when something is deeply wrong. Now, look again at Chris on the porch. He was not only lying to strangers, he was lying against the knowledge of the people who knew Shanann. He was betting that the public would accept the surface. But Nicole knew the routine beneath the surface. The house knew the routine. The car seats knew the routine. The phone knew the routine. The missed appointment knew the routine. And all of it said the same thing. Shanann did not simply vanish into her own choice. Something happened, and the person closest to her knew more than he was saying. That is how the story should build, not through wild claims, but through tightening certainty. At first, the audience sees a worried husband. Then they see the friend who does not believe the silence. Then they enter the home through the record. Then they see the items left behind. Then they see the truck. Then they hear about the affair. Then they enter the interview room. Then the first confession fails morally because it attacks a victim. Then the legal record corrects the lie. Then the court imposes the sentence. Then the story returns to the victims. This structure gives you tension without inventing anything. It gives you emotion without making unsupported claims. It gives you retention because each section answers one question and opens another. Why did Nicole worry? Because Shanann broke routine. Why did the house matter? Because it contradicted a voluntary disappearance. Why did the neighbor's camera matter? Because it placed pressure on Chris's morning timeline. Why did the affair matter? Because it exposed the double life. Why did the interview matter? Because the public story collapsed under questioning. Why did the first confession matter? Because even in partial admission, Chris tried to shift blame. Why did the plea matter? Because it ended the legal dispute over guilt. Why does the case still matter? Because it shows how image can hide danger inside the most ordinary place. Home. Now we move toward the final act. The courtroom did what courtrooms are designed to do. It took a chaotic public horror and turned it into charges, pleas, findings, and sentences. That process can feel cold compared with grief, but it matters because the law creates a record that cannot be replaced by rumor. Christopher Watts was not convicted by YouTube comments. He was not sentenced by social media. He was charged by prosecutors, processed through court, and sentenced after a guilty plea. That distinction matters because the internet can keep spinning theories forever. The legal record gives the foundation. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life without parole. The victim's family supported the plea arrangement that removed the death penalty from consideration, and the public was left with the knowledge that a man who once asked for his family to come home would never come home himself. There is a dark symmetry in that. On the porch, he asked for a return he knew would never happen. In court, the judge gave him a sentence that meant his own return to free life would never happen either. But do not mistake that symmetry for closure. Families do not receive their loved ones back when a sentence is read. Parents do not stop grieving because a prison door closes. Friends do not forget the last unanswered text. A community does not instantly feel safe because the case is legally over. Justice is necessary. But justice is not restoration. That is why the final emotional note must be honest. The Chris Watts case ended in court, but it did not heal in court. It became a warning about believing image over evidence, a warning about how hidden resentment and deception can exist behind family photos, a warning about the importance of checking on people when something feels wrong, a warning about the difference between a man's public performance and his private reality, and a warning about why victims must remain at the center, even when the killer's behavior draws the most attention. When viewers search this case, They often search Chris Watts' name. That is understandable because his actions drive the criminal record. But the names that deserve remembrance are Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Shanann's routines helped expose the lie. Bella and Celeste's absence made the house feel wrong. Nico's existence deepened the legal and moral weight of the crime. Their lives are not side details. They are the reason the case matters. As the years pass, the footage of Chris on the porch remains frozen in time. It still shows the same man, the same folded arms, the same house behind him, the same words asking for the impossible. But the meaning of that footage has changed forever. At first, it looked like a plea. Now, it looks like evidence of deception. At first, it sounded like fear. Now, it sounds like performance. At first, the public wondered where his family was. Now, the world knows he was the reason they were gone. That is the power of hindsight in true crime. The same moment becomes unrecognizable once the truth arrives. And once the truth arrived in this case, every earlier detail looked different. The missed calls, the quiet house, the vehicle in the garage, the car seats, the neighbor's footage, the television interview, the polygraph, the false confession, the guilty plea. Every part formed a chain, and at the end of that chain was the legal reality Chris could no longer escape. He did not lose his family. He killed them. He did not wait for answers. He hid them. He did not plead for truth. He performed concern. And the people who loved Shanann saw through the silence before the rest of the world knew what it meant. That is where this story should leave the audience, not with fascination for Chris Watts, not with endless speculation about his prison life, not with conspiracy, but with the simple, heavy truth that a friend's concern helped bring the first light into a dark case. Nicole Atkinson knocked. Police entered. A neighbor's camera recorded. Investigators pressed. The story cracked. The court answered. And the victims' names remained. Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, Nico Watts. If this case teaches anything, it teaches that evil does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it stands in front of a camera and asks for sympathy. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it lives inside the house everyone thought was safe. But facts still matter. Routines matter. Friends matter. Questions matter. And when the story someone tells does not match the evidence left behind, the truth has a way of finding air. Chris Watts wanted the world to see a grieving husband. The record showed a murderer. He wanted the world to believe his family had vanished. The evidence showed they had been taken from life. He wanted time. Nicole Atkinson took that time away. He wanted control. The investigation took control away. He wanted a new future. The court gave him none. And that is why the porch interview still chills people years later, because it captures the exact moment between lie and exposure. A man standing outside a home, pretending to search for the people he had already destroyed, a camera recording his words, a community watching, and the truth, already inside the house, waiting to be found. If this story held your attention, like this video, share it with someone who follows true crime, and subscribe to True Crime Investigator Alex for more documented cases told with respect, accuracy, and focus on the victims.